introduce our panelists. At the podium, getting ready to speak first is Signe Wilkinson, who I'm sure most of you in the room know, maybe most of the world too. Editorial cartoonist with the Philadelphia Media Network, Pulitzer Prize winner, and all-around good person. To her right is Cullum Rogers, an editorial cartoonist who is currently a freelancer, but also has a deep and abiding interest in historical study of editorial cartoons, advertising, things like that. And to his right is the two people sitting next to each other at the end are alums of our program at the School of Journalism and Mass Communication. Bastian Vanecker, who's currently at Loyola Chicago, which almost made it in the NCAA, so close. And next to him is Janelle Belmas, who is at the William Allen White School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Kansas. And well, that's true. But, you know, it wasn't the same heart rate. Well, anyway, it depends on where you are, I suppose. So Signe's going to start us off with her provocative paper.
Thank you. So, thank you for having me. And Jane, thanks for this terrific symposium. In the oral arguments of Hustler Magazine, Inc. v. Falwell, Jerry Falwell's lawyer haughtily stated that modern people have become acclimatized to, quote, the kinds of things that, had they been depicted at an earlier age, would have been regarded as socially unacceptable, unquote. He clearly hadn't seen the scabrous cartoons that illustrated Martin Luther's writings of the early 1500s. According to Martin Luther, Treasures of the Reformation, the gorgeous book accompanying the Minneapolis Institute of Art's recent exhibit, Here I Stand, it says, quote, the Reformation triggered the first boom in mass media political cartooning. I thank Thomas Rasher, who is here today, one of the Art Institute's curators, for giving me permission to use their images from this book today. When Luther nailed, allegedly, his 95 theses to the Wittenberg church door in 1517, he didn't go home and sit by the fire. As Michael Kahn noted last night, he ginned up his day's social media, the printing press, to attack Catholic church leaders in Rome. He used biting woodcut parodies for those leaders to illustrate his texts. 465 years later, Larry Flynt followed Luther's rhetorical footsteps, though his cartoon parody was pathetically mild in comparison to Luther's. Take this 1545 cartoon, which isn't the cartoon I wanted. It's called The Birth of the Pope and the Cardinals. It shows, not too clearly here, the naked female fury on the left pooping out the figures of the Pope and 5 vestment-clad cardinals. And just in case you didn't know where Luther stood, it appeared in a tract entitled, Against the Papacy in Rome, Founded by the Devil. Perhaps a slightly funnier one, though still outside modern newspaper decency norms, is this 1545 tune of Pope Paul III holding out a proclamation that Luther opposed. Instead of kissing the Pope's hand, the peasant figures on the left are smirking and passing gas from their bare bottoms. Luther's inscription reads, "Do not, Pope, attempt to scare us with your ban, and be not such an angry man, lest we turn to take up the fight by showing you a pretty sight." Of course, Catholics of the day had their own printing presses and used them to return rhetorical fire. Hans Brossemer's widely circulated woodcut shows Luther with 7 heads that purport to chronicle his descent, starting as a simple monk on the left to one of the New Testament's most hated characters, Barabbas, on the far right. Other images showed Luther's tree of faith as a barren, snarled with thorns and devils and promiscuous figures. It's an amazing piece of art that probably couldn't be done by deadline today. Cartoons about Martin Luther didn't stop at his death in 1546. Luther's excremental humor was used against him in this 2016 drawing by, whoops, we just missed, whoops, by Slug Signorino in straightdope.com, showing the anti-Semitic Martin Luther pooping out Hitler. Other than reminding us that there's nothing new in scathing anti-clerical imagery, what does Luther's prolific use of profane and sometimes violent cartoon parodies against the Pope have to do with Hustler v. Falwell? Well, for starters, the justices focused on Falwell's status as a public figure, not as a religious figure. Religious figures, at least ones wearing nice vestments, are often granted more deference than politicians. For example, when I asked a group of cartoonists and editors if any of their papers would run a cartoon like Luther's Today, not a hand was raised. And it continues today. Let's take a notorious recent example, Pat Oliphant's The Annual Running of the Altar Boys, which caused, as we all know, a furious protest. If the hugely influential and politically powerful Catholic Church sued over an image like this, would the justices, 2 of whom were Catholic, have considered the complainants to be more deserving of protection than the self-promoting and slightly ridiculous Jerry Falwell? In modern times, the church doesn't have to sue. Most newspaper editors are careful about running cartoons dealing with established religions. They run them, especially when there's a controversy, but they have their limits. Of the approximately 250 papers that subscribe to his work, only 4 or 5 printed Oliphant's Saint Pedophilias. Yet Catholic groups still point to it as a prime example of anti-Catholic bias. They could look at it as an example of how most newspapers protect the church by not printing the most biting cartoons about it. It's also worth noting that there are many readers who would have enjoyed seeing Oliphant's work, and many of them were editors who did not run it. The second reason the Luther cartoons attacking religious figures raise interesting questions about the Falwell case is that it was heard many years before 9/11 and before America's full realization that Islamic extremists wanted to crush America. How might the justices have ruled had they known that publishing a drawing of the religious figure Muhammad, oops, there we go, oops, back, Muhammad, as the Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten did in 2005, would bring more than emotional distress to Muslims worldwide? What if they knew that it might spark deadly riots and lead to physical attacks on cartoonists and their publishers? For cartoonists and free people everywhere, the Charlie Hebdo massacre and the Danish cartoon furor made Hustler v. Flint even more important. What the extremists behind these incidents are claiming is that they have the right to control any images relating to their version of Islam. The terrorists may have that ability in the lands that they control, but they should not have it in the United States of America. When people claiming to represent a religion enter the political fray, cartoonists should have the freedom to cartoon them in the same way they cartoon every other actor on the American stage. This is summed up nicely in Joseph Kepler's brilliant 1879 cartoon, The Religious Vanity Fair. In it, he satirizes Catholics, Jews, Presbyterians, Methodists, Mormons, Episcopalians, Baptists, and even the New Age guru sitting on the red couch, Henry Ward Beecher, who was, like Falwell, a roving evangelical minister who attracted crowds of thousands. The lesson for every new religion coming to America seeking freedom is that when their followers enter the public sphere, cartoonists will treat them as the public figures they are. This is a compliment. They are being treated as equals. For cartoonists to treat them any differently would be downright un-American. So, thanks to the Supreme Court 30 years ago for backing up this fundamental First Amendment right. Thank you.
Where's the... Okay, window, close yourself. It's not closing itself. Well, I'm not sure the "it" I'm hitting is the right "it."
This was an image used by both Catholics and Luther. Tom Rasher says it's always been about
Which one?
against
Thank you.
Rogers?
Yes, yes.
Others say that it was Luther who was the
So, yep, there we are.
played by the devil.
Going down to, now it's just this, right?
There you go.
There you go.
Just right to go to the next page.
Luther cartoons, did Luther commission other people to draw them?
Yes, one of the great artists of his time, including Lucas Cranach the Elder, who I would say Cranach, but Thomas Rasher has corrected me. And Dürer did some, and other really top cartoon artists at the time.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to present some, instead of political cartoons, these are parodies of advertisements. Falwell and Flint was not only the first religious parody, but not the first religious parody. It was not the first political cartoon, not the first parody to involve advertising. So here are some examples, a quick and dirty survey of early fake ads that parodied real ads, mocked real people, and ran in newspapers and magazines. 2 years ago, the Boston Globe ran a fake front page depicting the awful things that would happen if Donald Trump became president. The Times of London pulled the same stunt in the 18th century, only its targets were English radicals besotted with the French Revolution. On November 6, 1794, the Times filled all of page 3 with the front page of a paper dated 5.5 years in the future and called The New Times. In the New Times, atheistic traders rule Britain, St. Paul's Cathedral has become a temple of reason, Parliament has been destroyed, and the ultimate insult, taverns are serving wine instead of beer. It's a mistake to call the New Times a self-parody because it was created by anonymous hacks working in the dirty tricks department of Prime Minister William Pitt's administration. It was the custom in those days for newspapers to sell their souls to politicians, and the Times sold its soul to Pitt's Tories. So it's no coincidence that the New Times appeared the exact same day that jury deliberations began in the trial of 12 prominent English radicals for high treason. 4 of those radicals were mentioned by name in the parody's ads and notices, which in those days occupied most of the front page of newspapers, including writer John Horne Tooke and Unitarian minister Jeremiah Joyce, who is depicted in the New Times as the Reverend Citizen Joys, overseeing the celebration of the destruction of Parliament. Despite that heavy thumb on the scales, all 12 defendants were acquitted. The Globe's parody didn't work either. A generation later, a radical printer and author named William Hone fired back. Hone was famous for his self-published attacks on the big names of his day, including the Prince of Wales and the Duke of Wellington, who at that time was Tory leader in the House of Lords. Hone was basically the first pop culture nerd. He collected parodies and ephemera and loved parodies. Many of his pamphlets were parodies of other kinds of publications. Two of them were newspaper parodies, both directed at a quarrelsome reactionary journalist named John Stoddart, or as Hone nicknamed him, Dr. Slop, for reasons too complicated to go into here. The first was Bonapartophobia in 1815. In 1850, this broadside knitted the most extreme passages of Stoddard's anti-Napoleon editorials into one long rant. Home renewed the attack in a second fake newspaper called, bluntly, A Slap at Slop. Like the 1976 movie Network, A Slap at Slop predicted media developments that later became common. Its front page consisted entirely of ads, as was the custom, but Hone gave them bold headlines and large illustrations, all drawn by the great George Cruikshank, who later illustrated Dickens. One of them showed Wellington forcing a sword down the throat of Britannia at the top of the page, and the other at the bottom showed a rat wearing a judge's wig, admiring its reflection in a polished boot. The rat ad may have been the first ever parody of a national ad campaign. Warren's, at the time, Robert Warren's matchless blacking was the problem, i.e. shoe polish. It had become famous in the 19th century with an ad showing a cat admiring its reflection in a polished boot. Actually, the cat wasn't admiring, the cat was startled by its reflection in the boot. But in Hone's parody, the boot is obviously Wellington's, and the rat is a man named Charles Warren, a former radical who turned Tory in exchange for a judgeship and £1,000 a year. The fact that Charles Warren wasn't any relation to Robert Warren, but the fact that they shared the last name, and the fact that the Duke was so famous for his boots that he gave his name to them, the Wellington boot was named after the Duke of Wellington, must have been irresistible to Hone and Cruikshank when it came to parodying Charles Warren. And the fact that Cruikshank had also drawn the original ad for Warren's shoeblacking didn't hurt. Some parodies exist just because their subjects are such juicy targets. At the turn of the 20th century, one of the juiciest was a writer and lecturer named Elbert Hubbard. Hubbard was inspired by William Morris's arts and crafts movement and preached a vague but lofty sounding bohemianism. In 1895, he founded the Roycroft Press in New Aurora, New York, to publish his own pocket-sized monthly magazine, The Philistine, a periodical of protest. The press grew into the Roycroft community of artisans, and the Philistine reached a circulation of 200,000, making it the most successful little magazine, in quotes, in American history. Hubbard wore capes and wide-brimmed sombreros, assailed the rich as hypocrites and idlers until he started hanging out with them, and spread a doctrine of elective affinity that sounded a lot like free love. He called himself Fra Alberto, and his followers were the American Society of Immortals. His opponents called him insufferable. One of those opponents was a man named Bert Leston Taylor, who was a columnist for the Chicago Tribune, one of the first newspaper columnists in the modern sense, as a matter of fact. In April of 1901, Taylor introduced his readers to Fra McGinnis, a leader of the Society of Boy Grafters. McGinnis appeared within a month. Hubbard had written enough McGinnis stuff, or rather, Taylor had written enough McGinnis material to collect it in a booklet, and in May of 1901, he issued a little booklet, a fake magazine called the Billistein, a periodical of knock. Taylor was a former typesetter, and he made sure the Billistein resembled the Philistine in size, in paper, in type, everything. It was followed by a second issue in October. It was such a success. The Billistein was mean, funny, and unsubtle, but its most personal digs were buried in the back in the classified ads, the Affinities Wanted section. One of them, in one, a lady named Alice, 18 years old, quote, 18 years old and fond of good eating, theaters, and other pleasures, unquote, seeks an affinity, quote, born in the sign Taurus and the soul key of F sharp, unquote. Alice is Shirley Hubbard's lover, Alice Moore, who had given birth to their daughter in 1894 and became Hubbard's second wife in 1904, shortly after he divorced the first. Alice, far from being an airheaded teenager, Alice was 40 years old in 1901, a noted feminist and the general manager of the Roycroft community, which at that time had more than 500 members. Hubbard himself was mocked on the opposite page in 3 consecutive ads that grew more and more flattering in their self-description and less picky about the object of his desire. The last one said that, quote, any old zodiacal sign will do, but the affinity must be handsome and good form, end quote. In December 1931, the former editor of Life and Judge, Norman Anthony, launched a humor magazine called Ballyhoo. Ballyhoo was printed on cheap paper and mostly ran smutty cartoons and coarse ad parodies, but its smart-ass cynicism struck a chord with readers who weren't in a mood for 1920s-style boosterism. And it became one of the biggest overnight successes in publishing history. Within 6 months, it was selling 2 million copies an issue. Flamed out just as fast in the later 30s, but for a time it was great. Ballyhoo aimed most of its fire at Madison Avenue and at other publications, but it would occasionally take on individuals, such as President Hoover, seen here in May 1942, in an obvious takeoff on a Hoover vacuum cleaner ad. And in the same issue, May 1932, it went after publisher and physical fitness fanatic Bernard McFadden. McFadden began his publishing empire in 1899 with Physical Culture, which was the granddaddy of today's health and fitness magazines. He later introduced such lowbrow fare as True Detective and Photoplay, as well as more middle-class titles like Liberty. In 1924, he launched the New York Evening Graphic, a tabloid printed on pale pink paper whose focus on sex, crime, and celebrity scandal earned it the nickname the Porno Graphic. Without mentioning McFadden by name, Ballyhoo combined all these elements with the current ad campaign for Ipana toothpaste, which was at the time warning Americans to a hitherto undiagnosed danger called pink toothbrush. In the Ballyhoo version, the problem is pink tabloids, which can easily be solved with the application of truth paste. The graphic folded a few months later, though that owed less to Ballyhoo than to advertisers' reluctance to appear in it. That and the Depression. You can draw a straight line from Ballyhoo to the ad parodies in Mad Magazine a generation later. These 3, for instance, show Debbie Reynolds and Elizabeth Taylor fighting over Eddie Fisher, Nikita Khrushchev taking spy pictures during his tour of the United States, and of course, Ringo Starr for Breck ads. From NAD, it's a direct line also to National Lampoon, The Onion, The American Bystander, various one-shot magazine parodies, and most other manifestations of post-war American printed humor. I wish I had time to show some of those other ad parodies. I've got a dozen more on the thumb drive here. But my time is up, and I must hustle. Thank you.
Can you switch this mic on, please? Okay. Sophia McLennan this morning talked about how impersonation can be a very effective way to do parody, and we follow up on this a little bit by looking at impersonation accounts on social media, specifically Twitter, and how and when these accounts can run afoul of the law. Our analysis mainly focuses on Twitter, where parodists have been the most active. Twitter as one of the few social media platforms, allows parody accounts as long as it's clearly indicated that it's a parody, both in the bio and in the account name. In addition, Twitter usually will let those parody accounts up as long as no complaint has been filed. Do you have this? Okay. For example, in 2011, in the run-up to the Chicago mayoral elections, there was a Twitter parody account of Rahm Emanuel, which made fun of his propensity to use vulgar language. Now, Emanuel did not ask Twitter to take it down because he could have probably, because it did not clearly indicate in the account that it was a spoof. However, he let it up, he rolled with it, and he pledged $5,000 to the charity of his choosing if the creator of the account stepped forward, which happened after the election. The parodist got a book deal out of it. Emanuel won the election. Everybody happy. Not everybody has learned this lesson. Jim Ardis, mayor of Peoria, did not take well to a parody impersonation Twitter account depicting him as a vulgar boozer obsessed with drugs, alcohol, and prostitutes. Emails obtained through an Illinois FOIA request revealed how the mayor and his staff tried to get the account suspended and struggled to come up with a legal basis to find and prosecute the person responsible for it. The mayor wrote to his police chief, "Chief, it's not a joke and it's not funny. I want this prosecuted because what they did was wrong," and wrong was in capital letters. And his police chief wrote back, he says, "I agree, this isn't a parody." So they were frustrated, they couldn't find a law to, to make this go away, and then they thought they struck gold with the Illinois personation statute, which states that a person commits a false personation if he or she knowingly and falsely presents himself to be a public officer or public employee. However, the language of the statute implied that impersonating a public employee through an internet website or any form of electronic communication was only illegal when done with the attempt to defraud. So there was a huge public outcry about the squandering of tax dollars, and basically at the end the city ended up dropping the case. And to make matters worse, the mayor became mocked all over the media, and there's even a skating segment in the Daily Show mocking him for his thin-skinnedness. The man behind the account, on the other hand, who had been detained and his computer searched and his phone searched, received a $125,000 settlement. We looked at some other similar cases like that where people were parodying and imitating police departments or police spokespeople. In these instances as well, there were no actual convictions, even though one person ended up being charged and stood trial, but was acquitted. And what we found is that even though there have been no successful prosecutions, people have been detained, they've had their email searched, they had their phone searched, they've been facing legal actions or the threat of legal actions. And of course, it brings up the question how many cases there have been of parodists being intimidated by local authorities to drop their accounts by the mere threat of prosecution. Another legal issue we looked at is right of publicity. The right of publicity refers to a property right in one's personality and provides individuals with causes of action when their likeness is being used for commercial purposes without their consent. Now, in general, parody accounts are not commercial in nature. People do it to be funny, to get clicks, not really to make money. So they seem to be pretty well protected. And even commercial use of people's likeness might have expressive, artistic, or creative value, in which case the expressive element might prevail over the commercial interest of the plaintiff. We located some examples where plaintiffs threatening with questionable right of publicity claims were nevertheless successful in having the accounts taken down, at which point they withdrew their complaints. There's one example where we thought that maybe an account might potentially, hypothetically, run into troubles with the right of publicity tort. In the summer of 2017, a Minnesota teen impersonating Chance the Rapper had a tweet retweeted 250,000 times, more than any tweet of the artist himself ever generated. I'll leave it to, we don't have time to get into the debate whether or not this was really a parody or not, but there's a good argument to be made that this tweet had some parodic value. But when he was interviewed, this teen, when he was interviewed, why do you do this? Or when do you start doing that? He said, when I realized there was money to be made. So once he attracts enough followers with these fake accounts, he starts to push promotional tweets to them, and actually he's generating a mid-5-figure income doing this. And in our paper, we argue that this is something that might give rise to a valid right of publicity claim. However, Chance the Rapper thought it was a hoot, and he never made an issue out of it. And Janelle will now talk about some of the other legal issues that came out.
And this is on. All right, thanks. So when we started first, I'm going to stay here, I think it's probably easier. When we first started thinking about this, we started thinking about it in terms of some of the new actions, and we found out that really money was the driving issue behind some of these anyway, money and embarrassment. So when we first, again, started thinking about this, I ended up with copyright and trademark issues, and the ruling law right now, at least on dilution issues, and trademark dilution means the same thing it means, and dilution means the same thing it does in real life, which is watering down. And the current law on it is something called the Trademark Dilution Revision Act, which was in 2006, and it's an update of an earlier act. And what's interesting about it is it provides a special protection for parody, for parodic uses of trademark, particularly when they're non-commercial. And we have found that even some commercial parody uses have been protected in some of the lower circuit, or some of the federal circuits. One of them happened to come out of the Fourth Circuit. I don't have a picture, I should have probably pulled one. It's a dog toy called Chewy Vuitton, and it's a little handbag that dogs can chew on, and the court essentially said, well, nobody's really going to confuse that for Louis Vuitton. That, a little cheapy handbag that a dog can chew on is probably not going to be put out by, Louis, which their bags run to the tens of thousands of dollars, not so much. But the TDRA, or the Trademark Dilution Revision Act, expressly protects parody. In terms of social media, the best example, there are many, but the best example is that we found probably was the BP Public Relations, Global Public Relations account. The BP Public Relations account is a parody, and as you can see, in accordance with the TOS, Terms of Service, exists to get BP's message out. They kind of changed it later on to say this was parodic, but they didn't for a while. They were actually using what they called the Helios logo, which is the green and yellow. Then they changed it to the black and the drippy oil. People were actually fooled. They were writing, tweets like, you go yourself. But the tweets were like this: the ocean looks a little bit slimmer today, dressing it in black really did the trick. BP cares. We'll send you a free t-shirt if you send us $25, BP cares. All sorts of tweets that some people thought were really from BP. And this was after, of course, the huge oil spill that dumped 5 million barrels of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. BP didn't say a word about this. They said, we're too busy cleaning the thing up. People need this outlet. We're just going to let it ride. And that's what they did. There were a lot of people calling for them to take it down, to sue. BP just said, we're not going to do anything about this because we are a little nervous about this. We're not going to do anything about it. But there has been a change. Bastian and I both found that there's been a change in courts' willingness to extend protection to parody accounts, both in rights of publicity as well as in trademark. And the Dilution Revision Act is one example of that. And again, because there is no demand for takedown, we really don't have a case on this. Because again, they hadn't changed for a while, the logo, and people were fooled. There might have been an issue with deception, but because it didn't go to court, it's an academic question. So in terms of copyright issues, there aren't any in terms of the parodic content, but there are some in terms of content being owned and repurposed. A number, or three, or I guess it was three Twitter accounts that were owned by sports organizations that were dedicated to GIFs and Vines, which are small, user-created looping animations. And I didn't put any on here because I didn't want to worry about animations, but they were essentially little repeats that are made by users to sort of play up the things within, events within the game. They were complained about by sports organizations like the NFL, and it resulted in several of these accounts being suspended for either a number of hours to a number of days. And it affected about 1 million followers all told. And if you read some of the commentary afterwards, it was a whole bunch of young people saying, you old fogies don't know how this all works. You're going to be the death of the First Amendment, blah, blah, blah. And, so what ends up happening then is they put them back up, but all the offending gifs are pulled off, and now you're reduced to things like Stephen Curry is eating popcorn on a returning loop, which isn't really the purpose of it, but these are back up. And I think this is a major issue that is facing these sorts of concerns. Whether the NFL and other organizations are going to recognize that these are probably fair uses, and that under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act of 1995, which governs copyright on the internet, the requisite demands are that a good faith fair use analysis is required under a case that many know of as the Dancing Baby case, Stephanie Lenz versus Universal, where Prince sued for the use of Let's Go Crazy about the little baby driving around. Maybe nobody knows about that case, but that case essentially, on appeal, the court said, well, you got to engage in a fair use because clearly this was a fair use. It's part of DMCA. You have to engage in a fair use analysis. These gifts and vines probably would fall under fair use. There has also been an argument in the literature that there might be some copyright issues for catfishing. Catfishing, of course, is impersonating someone, taking over their personalities to lure other people into potential romantic relationships. There's a court case kind of going on having to do with the famous large family on television, the Duggar family, but that hasn't come to any fruition. I decided not to talk about it just in case something happened. So I don't know right now what is going on with that. But again, in terms of time, I want to just talk a little bit about some conclusions we had. As has been said many, many times before, parody has value. I can't say it any better than some of our other commentators. I use this cartoon in my textbook because it displays some of the things that were discussed in the Hustler case, Lincoln's long legs. In this case, we get Johnson being the tailor, sewing up the broken union. So we know that it has value. Rehnquist told us it has value, and we know from the cartoonists in the audience it has value. But some other things have come up as well that I think are going to be bearing some watching. There have been 3 states that have passed e-personation laws, California, Texas, and New York, that intend to protect against the stealing of individuals. The actual language is controlling fake or false profiles on social media with the attempt to protect against cyberbullying or identity theft for profit. Catfishing, I think, is among those concerns. Some have argued they're good, some have argued they're bad. Of course, most of them are too new to have been tested very much. Some of the language is very weak and wobbly. We tend to worry a little bit as legal scholars about weak and wobbly language because it can be misconstrued and misused. But since there are only 3 states, I guess time will tell. And just recently, on April 11th, 2018, FOSTA SESTA was signed by 45, and it has the potential of weakening Section 230. ST in that stands for sex trafficking. I don't know how many of you have heard of this, but there was a concern that Section 230 is an intermediary which provides protection for social media and other websites for third-party content that is posted on their site. So when I'm tweeting, if I tweet something naughty or nasty or infringing on someone's concerns, so I libel somebody, for example. So if I libel someone in my tweet, say I libel you in my tweet, you can sue me, but you can't really sue Twitter because of Section 230. That's simplistic, but that's essentially how it works, assuming that Section 230, thank you, Section 230, is that over? Or do I have that? No. Oh, all right, thank you. Section 2.
You don't personally have 10 minutes.
The whole panel has 10 minutes. I'll stop shortly. Very quickly, Section 230 weakens that. So Section 230 provides the ability for Twitter and other social media accounts to be protected against lawsuits. And SESTA FOSTA, while intended to provide sex traffickers with no out, will not provide, so Section 230 will not provide that sort of protection for sites that host sex trafficking content, has the potential to be misused like many other laws of unintended consequences. So we don't know how that's going to play out. It may be fine, it may not be fine, but the fact that the author of Section 230 was one of only a few people to vote against it, I have my doubts. And I will close with that. And thank you for the reminder, Elaine, and thank you to my colleagues and the audience.
A note from one of our panelists with a question she would like me to ask. I want to ask a separate question first because I wanted to ask it before I forgot it. Janelle, the e-personation bills that you're talking about or laws that you're talking about, are they geared, do you think, primarily toward protecting celebrities like the rapper and so forth, or are they for ordinary people, or what are they for?
The intention of these laws, and again, I haven't done a ton of research on this, but the idea, I think, is supposed to be against catfishing and against the cyberbullying, at least in California, and against identity theft in terms of profiting. So it's about, again, the money. One commentator I read about suggested that at least the California e-personation statute was really ambiguous and not particularly useful, and could easily be...
We can say that of most of the legislation coming out of California, in my opinion. But
Well, yeah, and they amend their constitution at the drop of a hat. And her argument, the scholar's commentary, was that it could easily be misused against protected speech. And that was her concern, but again, you know, the law, as most of us who study the law know, lags far behind technology. So many laws should probably be considered more closely before they hit the books. And I'm going to guess that e-personation, these 3 states' e-personation laws are among those sorts of laws. So I do not pretend to be an expert on them. I just we noticed them sort of at the last minute, and I thought, well, it might be good grist for discussion, but I don't pretend to be an expert. All I know is that they came up repeatedly in context of somewhat in terms of right of publicity, but primarily in terms of catfishing.
Okay, thank you.
Isn't it like a point of pride if somebody wants to impersonate you? I mean,
Well, the old joke is that you're not famous until a crazy person thinks they're you. And we may have to revise that. You're not famous until somebody thinks you're worth pretending to be.
yeah.
But who knows? Somebody somebody revised Andy Warhol's old statement about people, the fame in the future. In the future, everyone will be famous for 15 seconds.
Yeah, kind of.
To read, in the future, everyone will be famous for 15 people.
Well-
And that may be the case.
Well, and you know, I don't want to totally geek out on law, but do you mind if I mention Vanna White? Or do you want to talk about Vanna White? So there's a kind of a famous case with a fairly famous dissent out of the Ninth Circuit in California, but Justice Alex Kaczynski, who recently stepped down amid some other issues. Vanna White, as many of you know, was the tile turner on Wheel of Fortune. Samsung did an ad, but it was a parodic ad. It was a robot turning letters. This was, I think, 1990-something, robot turning letters. And they sued, she sued, basically under a right of publicity claim, I believe, saying that, you know, this was her and she didn't give any permission and that was not okay with her. And the court agreed and she won, and Alex Kaczynski said something to the effect of, it's going to become problematic just to remind the public of someone. This is a bad road to go down. It's bad law and it's wrong. And we have seen the courts, I think, since that time move toward moving away toward the White versus Samsung opinion toward more protection for parodic commentary. Not only in rights of publicity, and we talk about that more in our paper, but also in trademark, which I was not aware of.
Thank you. Are there questions, or I will ask the panelists questions? So, questions? There's one in the
There's
back
a
of the
hand
room.
at the back.
Yeah, I can barely see it.
Yeah, so I had a question actually for the team that worked on this piece that came here at the end. Did you look into the impact with things like the Yes Men, right, where they're impersonating, say, the Chamber of Commerce, right? Because it's my understanding that they've hit some serious issues too, and then they're not product accounts, right? They're showing up and doing press conferences on, you know, saying that, oh, we've suddenly decided to acknowledge climate change, those kinds of things.
No, we haven't.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I ran across some content that talked about them a little bit. I am not aware of there being, I mean, law is reactive, not proactive, so I'm not aware of any cases that have been filed against them. I might be wrong, I'm not aware of any. I have seen them mentioned in some of the literature, but we did not go into them in terms of any sort of legal action being taken against them. It's possible I missed something, because stuff happens all the time, but I have seen them mentioned regularly in the literature as something to be watched. So they're on our radar. We didn't address them in this paper, unfortunately, and part of it was just a timing issue, a time issue. But did you?
No, I think we tried to focus on actual cases that we saw something happened around, rather than, there's lots of hypothetical cases that, like the Chance the Rapper, that's a hypothetical case because nothing came out of it. But most of our paper, we try to focus on cases where there actually was some kind of action, and we see that oftentimes, maybe kind of going back to New York Times versus Sullivan, this notion that people like Rahm Emanuel or Chance the Rapper, they kind of get it a little bit, that you cannot go for every single slide or issue you don't like online, that you cannot go to court. We see that's more a local police force, a small town mayor. Those are the people who sometimes don't quite get that and start to some ill-informed legal action.
And speaking of that, to ask the question, we noticed during Signy's presentation that she included a slide that had quite a few drawings and parodies of the Prophet Muhammad. Mm-hmm. And many in this room, I'm sure, remember when the controversy arose over the Danish cartoons being published. It was often very difficult to actually see the cartoons here in the United States because so many newspapers chose not to publish them. I remember I just happened to be in Spokane, Washington in the midst of that, and was talking to one of the editors from the Spokesman Review, and he said, I can't endanger my staff, I can't endanger my family, we're not running those cartoons, that's all there is to it. And so, any reaction to that from panel?
Well, the number of, as most of the people here know, the number of papers that published are very, very few, and one of them was the Austin Statesman American, which published. Yeah, but as I recall, it was just before all the real big controversy, and before anyone, even Muslims, knew that they were supposed to be upset about having this picture shown. And then, like the week later, so there was no reaction to the Austin paper.
There was not much reaction to it. People were kind of surprised that the Statesman was one of the very few papers that ran the offensive picture.
Well, by the time then the Denver, the Rocky Mountain News, I think, did it, and the Inquirer, with a woman editor, I'm happy to say, published it inside in a box saying, we're just publishing it to show because we think our readers are adults and can understand that we're showing them something that's a major world event. Well, they did it, and then there were protests outside, and Muslim groups got very angry and whatnot. But there were op-eds in the paper, and from it, this huge interfaith movement started in the city of Philadelphia, working on the whole issue, and now it's quite robust. So my feeling is that that cartoons don't stop conversation; they start it, and that's why we should keep on keeping on.
And William Penn would be proud. And we are out of time for this panel, I'm afraid. Our next panel is going to follow immediately, and it's a great segue, actually, into the next panel, which is threats to satire here and abroad. So if the next panel would please come down and take your places. And thank our incumbent panel for it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
I didn't open those bottles, Elaine. They're fine.
There should be one more pen up here.
Hi. I'm going to introduce you, and you're on your own.
Right. Vaguely, yeah. And because that's probably who own they probably did it on the copy of the issue, right?
Thank you.
Spotlight. I feel like I'm about to be asked if I've ever been in the Communist Party. I think I'd rather go up because then we can see more easily that our slides are in the right place.
So I think you're starting off, right? And then
Yeah.
I'll finish up
Yeah.
with the part about religion, I think.
Yeah, you can talk about that, and then I'll come back. I've got a couple of slides after that where I just talk about
Very good.
that it's, not only do we culturally consider religion a topic of public discourse, but that was the reasoning that the court rested on.
Yeah. Yep, I have this because I have my little notes in the back.
A nice little bow.
What order we are sitting.
Well, it's going to be about,
Probably running this. Yes. I'm not a good thrower, so I'll just.
Hey, hi, good to meet you. It's fun. By this point in the day, I have to pay attention anyway.
Are you going to be standing? I can stand all the time.
I don't know. I think it's just over there. I think we're gonna have to
Yeah.
go up.
Thanks.
We got another chair. This is me at the kids' table at the end.
the kids' table, I'll see her.
No, I got it. Go ahead. The ReToo movement. How are you?
Hi, Rachel.
Hi. Good to see you too.
Good to see you.
You guys want to move it? We can, I mean, we can.
So, yeah, this is okay. This is okay.
Sorry. There we go. Okay, you're sick of listening to me anyway. My sole purpose is to introduce the moderator of this panel, who's Giovanna Dell'Orto. She's an associate professor at the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication, so she's one of my colleagues. She's also affiliated faculty in the Department of Political Science. She is our scholar on things international par excellence. She has more books than I can recount here, and monographs and all kinds of interesting things, and she too is a PhD from our program here. She's also worked as a reporter and editor for the Associated Press, and has a lot of journalistic credentials as well as scholarly credentials. And I will now leave her to take you to our next panel.
Well, thank you so much, Jane. That was a too kind introduction, but true. So there is that. I really appreciate it. And indeed, my just in case you're curious, book number 7 just went to the publisher. And the reason why I'm bringing it up is not the crass plug reason. It's rather the fact that it actually deals with refugees and integration and sort of the clash of religion, which is one of the issues that I know several of the panelists will actually address. We have a really exciting panel this afternoon for you that is basically split half and half between scholars and professionals, and it's a balance I love to see. And I think we're going to start with the scholarly presentation first, And the sort of more professional perspectives, if you will, coming right after. I have a few questions, I hope, and I'm sure you will have a lot of questions as well, so we'll try to maximize the Q&A. But without further ado, I'm actually going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves very briefly, to just give us a sense of what their background as well as their areas of expertise are. So Andrew, why don't we start with you?
Okay. Well, hi, I'm Andrew Pritchard, and I am a proud alum twice of this institution, and very happy to be back, because the last time I was in this building, it cost me $50,000. So today is fantastic. Spent back in the day, I put in 4 years on the Minnesota Daily, another proud alum. Spent some years in journalism, including on the Pioneer Press, and currently assistant professor focusing on media law issues at Iowa State.
I am Courtney Karstens. I am a senior at Iowa State, and I have co-authored this paper with Dr. Pritchard, and I am editor-in-chief of Veritas at Iowa State, which is a political magazine.
Hi, I'm Ritu Kanduri. I'm a cultural anthropologist at the University of Texas Arlington, where I teach courses on South Asia, media, visual culture. I'm an associate professor there. I got my degrees in history from India, and then my PhD in cultural anthropology from UT Austin. And my book is on political cartoons in India. Thank you.
I'm Chip Bach. I'm an editorial cartoonist with Creators Syndicate. I'm also on the steering committee of Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, which has an interest in what we're doing here.
My name is Joel Pett. I'm also an editorial cartoonist in Lexington, Kentucky, and for the Sierra Club magazine. But my role here today is because of my work on the board of the Cartoonist Rights Network International, which I realize sounds like a joke. But along with Matt Worker, who's in our audience, we do our best, along with this ragged little group of volunteers, to advocate on behalf of cartoonists around the world who are working in a, shall we say, a less receptive environment.
Well, thank you so much for that. As you can see, it's a very interesting variety of perspectives. I thought we would start with one of the thorniest, really, questions that are raised in the environment that we have today, and this is the paper that you see behind me by Andrew and Courtney. And if I can quote briefly from your paper, I think what we're going to be talking about, as you put it, is the pros and cons, the advantages and disadvantages, if you will, of, quote, the immense protection for offensive religious speech that appears to be afforded differently depending on context, in your case, in the United States and in many European countries. So take it away.
Exactly.
Am I in the way of the PowerPoint, or is this?
I think we'll be okay. It's all the important stuff is on the top half anyway. So, well, thank you for that. I think we're picking up really on a question that we posed, or we collectively posed this morning, and that is asking, what is the message of Hustler's Campari ad? And our paper argues, in effect, that to understand really what the message of Hustler's ad is, we need to think of it not just as speech that raises a First Amendment issue, and not even just offensive speech, but as offensive religious speech. Right? And that if we miss the religious dimension of what is being said in the Hustler ad, I know it's hard when we think of Larry Flint, religion is not really the first thing that comes to mind, but he actually is, we contend, expressing a religious message, however unintentionally, through his parody advertisement about Reverend Falwell. And if we understand that, we can understand a bit then about how the Hustler decision is not just about the First Amendment within the United States, but really represents, and in some ways makes final, the break between the United States and our fellow Western liberal democracies on the legal protection for offensive religious speech. As we noted, several folks have noted, we talked a bit about this yesterday and just heard a presentation about this today. Controversy over religion and images is not new. It goes back at least to the Reformation. We would contend it even goes back further. As the controversy has moved forward toward our current iteration of it, that we put roughly at about the publication of the Muhammad cartoons in 2005. If you wanted to argue that it goes a little earlier to publication of the Satanic Verses, I wouldn't necessarily disagree. But we have seen the controversy become less about religious doctrine and more about the place of religion in society, and yet we're still looking at religious speech at its core. So what is it about religion and images that makes this such an explosive topic? Why does Western civilization especially keep coming around to this issue? Right, well, because the nature of images is that they do something religious and political and moral authorities really don't like. Right? They might not like us thinking so much, but they really don't like it when we're not thinking. Right? They really don't like it when we look at the image and we have this immediate, visceral, full-body reaction to it. Right? Where are my fellow horror movie fans? Right? We like even the highbrow crowd here. All right. Okay. So we know. All right. Apparently I'm alone on this one, but there are these films, see, and they're kind of scary, right? And so if you happen to see one, right, at the point where the psycho killer or the monster jumps out from behind the door, right, even though we know it's just a movie, we have an immediate physical reaction, right, that shapes what we're seeing, that is independent of, unfiltered by, uncontrolled by our rational thought processes. Right? That's part of the power of images. That's also what makes them dangerous. Right? And in the Hustler ad, we have to pause for a little bit and say, well, where exactly is this coming from? So if you look at the Hustler ad, from a graphic design standpoint, it's really not a very pretty ad. Right? It is very text heavy. Apparently the dollar bill rule, not a priority at the magazine at that time. But what's really offensive about the Hustler ad, the emotional distress, is not the literal words that are written, right? It's the picture they conjure up. Right? It's the image that appears in my mind when I read the words about what happened in that famous outhouse and the reaction that I have to it. Right? So we have a case that is about images, even though it involves a lot of text. We get to images almost metaphorically rather than just having a picture. The other point about the Hustler ad that we think is key to understanding it is that we are talking here about religious subject matter. Right? Reverend Falwell is a public figure and is worth commenting on, drew the ire of Larry Flint and a lot of other people, not just because he used his position as a religious leader to have some political influence, but precisely because he staked out a position as a religious leader. Right? He became, much as it may seem odd to say this, right? Reverend Falwell is sacred. Words I never thought I'd say, but hang with me, right? He is sacred in the sociological sense, right, of being set apart, right, in his moral stance, in the life mission that he has carved out for himself, in his ministerial office, in the religion that he represents. We are dealing with sacred subject matter when we talk about this figure and what he represents. Right? So, what did the Hustler ad do? Right? Hustler ad gives us a little bit of blasphemy. Right? What is the message of the Hustler ad? The message is that we are going to profane the sacred. Right? We are going to take this set apart, right, sacred figure and the transcendence that he represents, and we are going to drag them down into the mundane, profane worldliness, right, of excretion and reproduction about as base as you can get. Right? Both of these topics, both sexuality and excretion, have been used historically in art and literature and philosophy of various kinds to designate the concerns of the world. Right? That Hustler, not even the first satirical publication to use the outhouse. This was in the early 20th century. Russian satirists were very fond of looking into the outhouse as a metaphor for where their ideological opponents came up with their ideas. Right? So bringing that in there, as well as sexuality has a long history in religion of being something that needs to be abstained from or carefully controlled. Right? We find this in religions throughout the world. And so to throw both of those, especially in the context of incest, at the Reverend Falwell, right, is not a political statement. It's not a theological statement. Its purpose is to take the holy and drag it down into, right, words that I won't repeat because sometimes my mother watches C-SPAN. Right? In most, all right. Well, they're missing out, right? In most countries, okay, in most countries, this would create some serious legal problems. Right? We have laws dealing with blasphemy and with defamation of religion in most of our fellow Western liberal democracies, right? I will not expect this room to be impressed with our fancy graphics, but there they are for your consideration. And my co-author will say a brief bit about why it is that the United States culturally has ended up in a different place in our thinking about offensive religious speech.
All right, so I think the big difference that we saw was a huge part of it was historically the European view of religion and its associations with it are very much rooted in identity. So Europe sees religion as an identity, and through that, it comes out of tradition. So historically, the Peace of Westphalia, if you guys don't know, is a piece of group of treaties that basically said if you're king of France, you decide the religion that country has. So that kind of gives you an idea that with identity, when you're making a joke about religion, it's really offensive. It's kind of seen as almost a racist joke in a way. So when you go to the American view, Americans, we're more independent. We're more individualist. And that kind of translates with our religion. It's important to see that because without that sense of without that lifestyle, we would have the problem of being offended, I guess, through what we do with the argument of our religion. So.
And from then that history of not having that officially provided religion, we get a couple of assumptions then that in European culture especially and European law have been largely rejected. Right? We get the assumption that religion is not something that is some immutable aspect of a person, that people are open to change and they are open to being persuaded. Right? Which means that offensive religious speech is not something like obscenity or incitement that serves no purpose except to injure. Right? It actually is a legitimate subject of public debate. Right? Not only because religion feeds into other topics, but because we have a culture which then feeds into the law that says religion itself is a topic suitable for debate.
Thank you. Okay. This is not on, is it? Yes, it is? Okay, sorry. The bridge that I see between the two papers, while you set up if you need to, is of course this question of identity. You raised the issue of religion as a part of identity. In this case, we're going to be talking about a little bit about national identity and the stereotypes that can be activated and how these cross what is essentially globalized and to some extent borderless communication world.
Thank you.
Go
I'm
ahead.
trying to pick up my PowerPoint here. Oops. How do we shift? Move to the next.
Escape, it'll take you back out to the folder.
Okay.
Yeah. And then which one is yours?
I can't find it here right now. Did it put?
I don't see it here. It's not there. Can we just maybe get started without that? And do you want to get started with this without the, or you prefer to wait for that? Or should we transfer to one of our other panelists perhaps while we have it?
Yeah, let's do that, if you don't mind.
Chip, Joel, Chip? All right, okay.
Can you make my pictures come up?
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, yours is there.
Yeah. Let's do that, and we'll use this one. Thank you. Thanks for your flexibility. Appreciate it.
Glad to help.
If we can keep it strictly to the 10 minutes.
Oh, you want me to use this?
You can if you like, but here is this, and it's just advance with that button right there.
Yeah. This button, right?
Yep.
Okay. Well, so if Jerry Falwell is sacred, it's really not something I'd thought about. We call that in our business sacred cows, and it's our job to kick them. I've put up here my favorite excerpt from the Flint-Falwell ruling by Justice Rehnquist. The appeal of a political cartoon or caricature is often based on exploration of unfortunate physical traits or politically embarrassing events, often calculated to hurt the feelings of the subject of the portrayal. Except nowadays, hurt feelings seem to be very important, and we tend to steer away from unfortunate physical traits. Ironically, the one guy who doesn't do that is President of the United States. Apparently now he's a cartoonist. He's come up with Little Fat Rocket Man, Crooked Hillary. There are things that we don't really say in cartoons anymore because they're regarded as too offensive in many cases. But let me go on to a cartoon I did. This is one of the by the way, I couldn't get approval from Martin Luther to use his cartoon, so I brought my own. This is a cartoon that, one of the first cartoons I drew in my first job with the Clearwater Sun. And it was, I was ahead of the curve, I guess. I liked making fun of unfortunate physical traits. And this fellow here was a commissioner. He was running for commission of the Largo City Council. It's a town adjacent to Clearwater. And the Sun had a story that he was found in his driveway stacking dimes up and down, up and down, up and down. And this is the beginning of the campaign. So I thought, well, it's a great cartoon subject. Typical fly coming out of his ear. All right, all right. So I'm not insane. I still have other qualifications for the Largo Commission. Later that week, the guy killed himself. So I don't really know why I put that up there, what that means, if that means we shouldn't mock physical traits because somebody might kill themselves. I don't think it does. I think that we need to do that, and what happens is whatever happens, even as terrible as it may be. Going up to in current times, just last week, Mark Zuckerberg spent hours and hours testifying before Congress. And I think this is emblematic of the real problem we're facing, the real threat to our freedoms that are surely protected by the Supreme Court in every way. We really have the imprimatur of the Supreme Court to do whatever the hell we want. But we really can't do it because times have changed, attitudes have changed. Political correctness is one factor, but another big factor are things like Facebook, which Zuckerberg testified about last week. And he was called on the carpet for offensive things that appear on Facebook. And he's supposed to regulate them. Well, this is a private citizen, a really rich private citizen, but he's a private citizen. And he's in charge with regulating a lot of the free speech in the United States now. And Ben Sass, a senator from Nebraska, asked him to define hate speech, and he couldn't do it. He said, well, I don't know what hate speech is, but we will have artificial intelligence look at speech, and that will decide what kind of speech is acceptable on Facebook. So I drew this little cartoon, and Big Brother didn't turn out quite the way I expected. And then the other aspect of threats to free speech comes from campuses in the United States. It's just unbelievable to me. The college campus is where the free speech movement really started when I was in college, and now it's a true enemy of the free speech movement. And Middlebury College was a great example of it. They shut down speakers. It's the bell curve guy that came to speak, and they shouted him down. They silenced him. They injured a professor who was with him. And I don't really know where this is going, because somebody before was telling me how great the millennials are, and the next generation after. If they're intolerant of different ideas, if ideas aren't allowed to hurt, if you have to feel safe, I don't see a lot of room for our business. Our job isn't to make people feel safe, it's to make them feel uncomfortable. And then, this is getting into foreign cartoons, and since time is short, I'm really not going to deal with that. But of course, you're risking your life drawing cartoons overseas, and you're not doing that here. You have other problems. Okay, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Really interesting cartoons that I hope we will definitely circle back to. Do we have the next presentation? Is it up? Yes, lovely, okay. All right, excellent. No worries. You got it? Yeah, no, happy to. Just, I'm gonna have to ask you to just keep it really to 10.
Yeah, it's 5 minutes, right?
Between 5 and 10, yes, that'd be perfect, yes, thank you. And again, in Rita's paper, which will look at national identity in cartoons and what she calls, in her paper, the paradox of social media and the question of, speaking to your Facebook point, how much power they have to censor, but also how can they be actors and give more agency to communities that might be offended by the power of stereotypes that are also present in cartoons. So I hope that's an adequate, well, I guess, yes, it clearly speaks to what I was just saying, so I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you, Joanna. Why are Indian Americans vigilant about images of India and Hindus? In the US, protests against offensive images in the case of Indian Americans can be framed as agency of an immigrant community. It can be framed as resistance to hegemonic ways of articulating free speech. Both agency and resistance convey an empowering position, one of claiming rights to portrayal and of jostling for a public space to self-representation. Yet such collaboration and coalition among Indian Americans of varying political stripes can have deeply conservative implications. Strategic, let's see where we are right now, can have deeply conservative.
Microphone a little
Closer?
Yes.
Okay. Such collaboration and coalition among Indian Americans of varying political stripes can have deeply conservative strategic connections that play out differently in the home country, India. Organizations such as American Hindus Against Defamation are extensions of the World Hindu Council, called the VHP, an organization that promotes Hindutva, a sanitized, authentic form of Hinduism that takes on conservative positions on gender, history, and culture back home in India, as well as by extension in the US. These connections open up important questions about how diasporic communities articulate hurt sentiments, experience emotional injury, practice cultural politics, and engage democratic rights. It also shows that in the global order, hustling free speech can be deeply fraught. It can give a new lease of life to the colonial imagination and its troubling representation of natives, within quotes, and unwittingly mobilize deeply conservative politics. What we have before us is an apology by the New York Times for a cartoon by Heng Kim Song. And I want to begin with this as one of two examples that I'll be touching on to elaborate on the brief introduction that I just presented. Heng Kim Song is a political cartoonist based in Singapore. In 2014, India successfully launched Mangalayan space mission to Mars. It was widely reported in Indian newspapers and social media. And the fact that was really marvelous about this project was that it was led by a group of women scientists, and so there was a lot of celebration in India. The historical linkages between space exploration and national pride is evident not just in places like South Asia, but also around the world. So the question before us is why these protests against Heng's cartoon, and what was visible to the irritated, offended readers, Indian readers of the New York Times, that neither Heng nor defendants of Heng's cartoons could see. So let's take a step and see what Heng had to say about the backlash against his cartoon. Mr. Heng said that he had researched India's, let me show you the cartoon now. So the cartoon on the top is by Heng, which is from 2014, and then in response to that, 3 years later, an Indian cartoonist, Adhwar Yu, made sort of a fitting response through another cartoon. So I've just put this together to give you a sense that there is a kind of a sparring match going on among cartoonists in India, between India and the US. So for Mr. Heng, he said that he had researched India's successful Mars mission and found that it had humble beginnings. He drew inspiration, he said, from something he read and saw, where a bullock cart was used to transport a satellite part in the 1980s. Quoting him here, "I was trying to portray India's engineering success despite the odds stacked against them." Now, against this representation, the critics of Heng in India and here in the US, of course, highlighted the fact that he had overlooked the big success, which was a group of women scientists being the people behind this mission, widely reported and represented in photographs in various social media platforms, and also that this was a project that was successful under budget. It cost less than a Hollywood film. And so there were many things to really celebrate in terms of this project, and what Heng did was to portray an Orientalist image. So what is this Orientalist image that is necessary for us to know in order to get a better sense of the context of the complaint? Orientalism is a concept that academically gained currency with Edward Said, Columbia University professor. And Orientalism sort of captures this way of thinking that can be quite oppressive for people from the global South. So Orientalism takes up a foundational statement by Karl Marx, who said that they cannot represent themselves, they must be represented. So this is sort of one famous quote by Marx. And Edward Said works against this, or sort of builds on this idea. Based on his work, I'm sort of summarizing what Orientalism is supposed to mean. It is the consolidation of a knowledge of the East, so a Western idea, Western consolidation of knowledge, by reducing the East to essential traits, rendering a complex culture and history simple, unchanging, and inferior to the West. So this portrayal of this farmer with his bull knocking at the door of an elite space club, it sort of reeks of Orientalism to anybody who is conversant with that concept. What is also interesting for those of us who know NASA, we know that a large number of people working in NASA are of South Asian origin. So what does it mean to actually represent and simplify in this manner, this kind of imagination? So that's one of the sort of the intellectual critiques against Heng's work here and his cartoon. Now, this is not the only time that Heng has taken recourse to such imagery. He has done that at other times also, and so this is the photograph, that circulated widely among many others of the women scientists. But again, this cartoon spar with Heng's work, ongoing sparring match, where he shows India as an elephant. And so this is not just a question of one sole cartoon drawing, but about a sort of a method for trying to represent India here that people from that country are taking offense to, and people of that origin who live in the US are taking offense to. So some years ago, I had the opportunity to ask one of England's foremost cartoonists, Nicholas Garland, why he continued to portray India as a tiger. Throwback on 19th century cartoons. Such cartoon imagery seemed too distant to me. Why did the tiger strike such immediacy for him? Surely he appreciated that India had changed, just like 19th century England had changed. This was an earnest question from me. I also knew that Garland had toured India. He had visited the country and had first-hand experience of its sights and sounds. For the sake of time, I will limit my conversation with Garland and observe that he is skeptical of the future of caricaturing cultural difference in global times. The cultural construction of the other is impossible when there are so many overlaps in lifestyle. Thus, using the tired old tropes is not about immediacy at all, but about a loss in the cartoonist's toolkit, a paucity of imagination, and also a desire to keep the other alive, because we need to represent the other in order to present what political issues are at stake. The New York Times is not exclusively an American newspaper. It has international editions. What does it mean then, therefore, to claim it as an American space and sort of to object to other people objecting or demanding cultural rights based on their interpretations and readings of images in that newspaper? I have under 1 minute left for my presentation, but I will sort of paraphrase what I had to present for you here. This is a second example that I wanted to talk about, a center spread from Maxim. This is a gentleman's magazine, and there was a hue and cry about this again because, as you can see, Mahatma Gandhi is being used as a prop. And sort of the racial connections here, the language here is evident. And the association that sort of brought together all the voices and represented the Indian opinion on this asked for an apology. Maxim was not quick to give an apology. They took a lot of time, but eventually when this group started contacting sponsors and advertisers and influence, the advertising in Maxim, then Maxim sort of buckled down and issued a quick apology. Now, I will just end by saying that all this can be seen as a way of strategically acquiring some kind of political agency to make your voice heard. Americans of Indian origin have a very tiered history of immigration to this country, and they constitute about 1% of the American population. So one way of thinking about why they might complain and take offense to these images is not just about their inability to appreciate humor or inability to look at the complexity of the images, but they're also looking at a history that belongs to them, a history of the way that the West has represented them and a colonial history. And it is a way of claiming a political space in India as immigrants. So they claim these rights as human rights, rights as immigrants, and as activists who are interested in conserving Indian heritage, Indian identity, Indian culture. But here's the downside of this. When we look closer into these groups that are aligning together, we don't notice a kind of a uniformity in their political ideologies. And on several occasions where these exercises in demanding apologies are successful, it is led by a deeply conservative Hindu right organization. So what is it, as somebody who's studying this landscape of this sort of tussle going on between images, it is a tortured position to be in because one can sympathize with demands for rights to self-representation, but at the same time, when it gets energy from right-wing conservative Hindus, then that creates that is very troubling. So that's the paradox with which I want to end this presentation, not by necessarily taking a position, but as a cultural anthropologist trying to look at both sides and sort of getting to the heart of the matter. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And as to our very last but not least presenter, and this is why everybody, of course, absolutely hates moderators, so I have to keep it going this fast. I apologize, but here you go. There you are. Yes, of course.
Yeah, still? Is that good? I've been worried all day about those speakers. They look poised to fall if they. It's like something you'd see on a college campus, right? A pile of bricks with a speaker on top of it. Yeah, I thought that guy working out, you know, hefting around not Mohammed. Why did you say that? Thank you, Mahatma, was highly offensive.
I can do that if you want.
Should have used a tiger. You know, Chip, you're going to feel like shit if Zuckerberg kills himself. Probably worse if a robot kills him. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that Matt Worker and I are on the board of the Cartoonist Rights Network International, which is in fact really but a very small group of people, mostly Robert Russell and Nick Kosar, who moved here from Iran before they could put him in jail. And I think now he actually has an official death sentence, if I'm not mistaken. So I don't really do anything except come to stuff like this and talk about it. So the people who do the real work aren't here. These are just various graphics that I really like about oppression of free speech. I have a handful of, just to maybe describe to you what our clientele is like and the people on whose behalf we advocate, and I'll run through them fairly quickly. This is a cartoon by Julio Gonzalez, pen name Matador, a Colombian, who received a number of death threats over having drawn the Ivan Duque, candidate Ivan Duque and President Alvaro Uribe in Colombia as pigs, which is kind of run-of-the-mill here, but apparently not in Colombia. Ramon Ebale in Equatorial Guinea, whose existence is now sort of in limbo. He spent some time in jail. I think he's now living in the Spanish embassy in Equatorial Guinea, and they won't give him a visa to leave, and he can't leave the embassy, a situation with which any of you have paid any attention to press freedoms and things of that sort are familiar with. Zunar is one of our very famous clients, a Malaysian who found himself crossways over the Sedition Act of Malaysia for such things as comparing their president to Robert Mugabe. And as is often the case, once the government starts oppressing you, then you start drawing cartoons about that. It's pretty powerful stuff, and it's also such a reminder of you know how good we have it here. This is Musa Kart, a Turkish cartoonist who was arrested last November along with a great number of other Turkish journalists. He is still being held. The first part of his trial was in December, but now it's been put off till September. He was and is a very famous Turkish cartoonist. This is his stuff here on the front page of one of the papers. And the translation of this as Lady Justice sort of sadly sweeps the red carpet is the fellow on the left says, "Be quick, the ceremony's about to begin." Kanika Mishra is an Indian cartoonist who became aware that certain clerics, tell me if I mess this up, okay, were in fact, rapists. Yeah, I always get the two confused. And started drawing cartoons about it. We gave her our the only award you don't want to win in cartooning is the International Courage Award, because it basically means you're in big trouble. I think the resolution isn't great on these, although they're way better than Chip's 1980 cartoon about the Florida, tiny nowhere Florida City Council. That was great. Poor thing. What method did he use for his suicide, Chip? Was he a shooter? But no, it doesn't matter. It's unimportant. I'm just interested in those sorts of things. One of our most recent well-known clients was the pen name Eaton Fish. His real name is Ali Durrani. Another Iranian who, interestingly, he was not a cartoonist before he fled. He was just a run-of-the-mill critic expressing his opinions against the Iranian government. And he fled to Australia, and then the Australians threw him in this prison on Manus Island that's rather notorious, where he was abused in various fashions, and then he started drawing cartoons about it. And to me, this really illustrates the sort of bleak nature of cartooning. He drew this cartoon about himself being on a hunger strike in prison, and beaten up and raped and all that sort of stuff. So he comes staggering out of there and he says, "God, look what happened to me, all this suffering." And the guy goes, "Well, look on the bright side, nobody's going to want to sexually harass you anymore." This is the office of somebody who got ransacked. I think it was an Israeli. Do you know this, Matt? I managed to leave it off of my notes. Oh, right. Mohammed Sabani's office after the Israelis took a look through it. And this is Arifur Rahman, a Bangladeshi who was persecuted by Islamic fundamentalists. And I think he was sentenced to 4 years in jail, but only spent 6 months, which was not a good experience for him. And when I looked up yesterday what he's doing now, he quit cartooning and is looking for other work, which they have their ways of making us want to do that in this country. Is that 10 already? It's what? All right, I'll blow through it real quick. That's something that he drew I thought was cool. This is Jake Thrasher, a college student in Mississippi, who, just so that you know, it happens here. Rebel Pepper, a Chinese. You'd be surprised that it happens in China. This is the last one, Don't Give Me the Hook. The Syrian cartoonist Ali Farzad was actually friendly with the Assad regime, drew for a newspaper that supported him. And in this country, when you run afoul, they write letters to the editor saying, "I can't believe you published that stupid stuff." But in Syria, they take you out and break all your fingers and beat the hell out of you, which is why I'm an immense patriot, despite all my criticism of our government. So thank you.
So while our trustworthy microphones are going to be through the audience, I'm just going to toss a couple of questions out for the panel, and then we'll take your questions. One is, and I think this last presentation, sobering as it was, raises it, but all of theirs did as well, In this era of social media and Facebook and fake news, has the environment changed so much that perhaps we need to rethink about this balance? In other words, if there are, and there are, sadly, rising levels of violence against journalists and cartoonists, which you brought up, does that change the equation? Should there be more care just for the very simple reason of trying to survive? That's a question really in a sense to that end of the table. And to everybody else, the question of, that we started with, that everybody would understand satire, well, do they anymore? I mean, when we're reaching levels of credulity that are truly beyond belief, pun intended, then where do we stand with that? Is it so obvious that it is satire? I wish I could answer yes. I have to admit that I am now worried, especially again when the cost could be in the blood of the cartoonists. So would anybody?
Well, living and working in Kentucky, as I mentioned that I do, I can assure you that not everybody does understand satire. Although we are proud of our famous homegrown Kentuckians, George Clooney and Ashley Judd and Jennifer Lawrence and Larry Flint. I'm embarrassed to say this, but I didn't really understand the question. Did you ask if we should do the work differently because of the...
Basically, yes.
Yeah. I don't think you can help but do it differently. I think Ann Telna said earlier that as soon as we learned as a group that, none of us knew you weren't supposed to draw Muhammad. Like, that wasn't a thing they give you at cartoon school, or anything like, make the lines behind them for running and don't draw Muhammad. And none of us knew it. And as soon as we learned you can't do that, everybody's first reaction is, the hell I can't. That's exactly what we wanted to do. So then we tried to think of ways to do it that wouldn't get the paper blown up and blah, blah, blah. You can't help but do it, but have that in your mind. And, as I tried to show there, it's, I can't even imagine what the most courageous response that I saw was this brilliant thing by Le Monde cartoonist JP, Jean Plantu, who very shortly after it became clear you weren't supposed to draw Mohammed, and his cartoons appear on the front page of a Paris daily, and it was this incredible, I'm so sorry I didn't include it, but put it on your phone, Plantu Mohammed, you'll find it. And it was basically the French phrase, I must not draw Mohammed, je ne dois pas dessiner Mohammed, over and over and over and over and over and over and over till he had made a Muhammad out of it. It was amazing, and more amazing that the paper would do it. So that question as to how it affects your work is like so not for us, but our people think they often, when they're sucking up to American cartoonists, say, "Oh, it takes such courage," and you're like, "No, it takes no courage." But around the world, a totally different story.
Agreed. When they call a cartoonist a courageous cartoonist in this country, it's kind of hilarious. We don't have to be courageous. We're, I hate to say this, and not because of the Falwell ruling, but we're almost like a protected industry. And we kind of suffer the same problems of a protected industry. Not really very daring, not growing, in fact declining. I don't know if that's got anything to do with it, but it might be a factor. As far as social media, I think you asked about, and do Americans understand satire?
Or anybody really, not just Americans, but is that a worry that people might not understand that, they might take for real what was clearly meant as satire?
Yeah, of course they don't understand satire. Enough people do, though, that those are the people we're drawing for. And the other people, I hope, will find out about it. We can't change our ways. We have to keep doing what we're doing. We have to do it more forcefully, I think.
Thank you. Let's open it up to the audience. Casey? There's a thing on in front. Almost there.
When you say that, though, you just have to keep doing it the way you do it. Ritu, you pointed out that the same cartoon now is seen in vastly different ways by different audiences. So that too makes it hard to do a satire. I mean, Americans could get it, and yet, for example, the Indians who saw the same cartoon in India thought it was insulting. Mm-hmm. You have comments on that?
Well, I just want to add that if we focus too much on the insulting part or offense or religious sentiments being hurt, then we are getting a fraction of the story. What I have seen is more helpful is what people are doing with these cartoons. What are they using it for? And when a group or a community is disenfranchised, what are the ways in which they can intervene in the public space in order to get a voice? Now, in a place like India, Christians are a minority. They use cartoons, they sort of reject cartoons that present them in an unflattering way. So there, it's not Islam necessarily or Prophet Muhammad. We're talking about Jesus Christ, cartoons about Christ, and the Christian groups getting sort of unnerved about it. So where I kind of see it fruitful is to stop obsessing about Prophet Muhammad and stop obsessing about Islam as the only issue. We have these kinds of groups in all religions, and therefore we need to sort of look at them all and sort of be able to invoke, all these religions together rather than just isolate one as a problematic sort of way of thinking, or one religion as being the problem. I don't know if I've answered your question completely, but yeah, that's how I sort of look at it as an anthropologist.
I had this thought during when she showed the Indian cartoon that the tigers are almost extinct, and even after they really are extinct, there'll still be cartoonists using it as a symbol for India. Like we're still drawing like millstones and anvils and stuff like that. So I'm afraid it's hopeless. The tiger, I don't know. It's a sacred tiger, though.
Chip, you say things can't be changed, or you have to keep doing it the way you're doing it, but I'm wondering if cartoonists have made most of their effects by barbs, by kind of smashing other people, and I'm wondering if satire can be used to bridge some of the current tribalism that we're seeing in the U.S.
Never thought of that.
Anybody care to take that one?
Can satire be used to make tribalism go away, to bridge tribalistic attitudes? I have a hard time honestly seeing it that way. Satire, and to Signy's question also, we're no longer just a local audience or just have an American audience. Our cartoons can appear worldwide. But I do think it's important that we hone our craft the way we see it and continue to do things the way we see them and insist on it. And that can be seen by other people in other countries, other places, as confusing. But I think so be it. People in other countries should do their cartoons the way they always have. Of course, easy for me to say. Nobody's going to bash my fingers. But I think there's real value to that. There's real value to seeing a point of view from another place that reflects a whole different set of attitudes. People don't see the world the same way we do. And you can call that tribalism on our part here in America. We have lots of tribes here that are constantly fighting each other, and I don't see editorial cartooning as a real mediating process. I see it as a focusing on a point, making a point and making it clear as possible from the cartoonist's point of view.
I think you should be the new cartoon mediator to heal the problems of the country. I wanted to correct one little factual thing that I heard twice during this symposium. And that was that the numbers of print cartoonists with jobs at papers has dwindled to under 50. By my count, it's under 30. So just wanted to update that. And then...
like the national debt clock.
Yes, that's right. The death of cartooning clock. Okay, so the idea that that we could do anything other than make the tribal gap worse is just crazy. Like we have no tools for reconciliation of any kind. I've thought about this a lot lately because it's occurred to me as I get older that I've wasted my entire life, and so have all my pals, at something that was utterly futile and nothing, all the stuff we've railed against. You saw Mike Peters' cartoon about well, there was one about the Catholic Church and then another that the fellow described about the solar industry that are like 40 years old. And, you know, the gun cartoons, like everything has just gotten worse. We have wasted our whole lives. The only good piece of it is these things where we get to come and be with our pals and have people act like we're important when really we blew it. So, sorry. Sorry, kids. Oh, and smoking.
Okay.
Well, we will.
Oh, right, smoking has, yeah, right. Not in Kentucky, although you can't do it indoors.
So I have a question back here.
Yes.
But first, before my question, I did want to remind everyone, in case they forgot, because it's useful to remember, that shortly after Charlie Hebdo, Kofi Annan, or actually after the Danish cartoon controversy, Kofi Annan led a UN-headed cartooning for peace. And it does happen, and it is valuable. And there are some times when folks have sort of mobilized cartooning to build alliances and make connections. So not to diminish cartooning to piss people off, but there's definitely a good history there, and one worth remembering. And? Okay, fine. Needless to say. Okay, all right. Anyway, that wasn't my question, though. Okay.
Reconciliation of the cartoons that have been done throughout this whole conference coming up promptly at 3:30. So we need to stop, and I need to ask you to thank the panel. So please thank the panel.
Yeah, absolutely.
That would be great. It's really,
Keep working
I mean,
on this.
kind of
There's
super
some
interested
big,
in the context of the
yeah, there's some big ideas